Chapter 27. In the early months of World War II, San Francisco's Fillmore District, or the Western Addition, experienced a visible revolution. On the surface, it appeared to be totally peaceful, and almost a refutation of the term revolution. The Yakamoto Seafood Market quietly became Sammy's shoeshine parlor and smoke shop. Yashigira's hardware metamorphosized into Le Salon de Butte, owned by Miss Clorinda Jackson. The Japanese shops, which sold products to Nisei customers, were taken over by enterprising Negro businessmen, and in less than a year became permanent homes away from home for the newly arrived Southern blacks. Where the odors of tempura, raw fish, and cha had dominated, the aroma of chitlings, greens, and ham hocks now prevailed. The Asian population dwindled before my eyes. I was unable to tell the Japanese from the Chinese, and as yet found no real difference in the national origin of such sounds as ching and chan and moto and kano. As the Japanese disappeared soundlessly and without protest, the Negroes entered with their loud jukeboxes and their just-released animosities and the relief of escape from Southern bonds. The Japanese area became San Francisco's Harlem in a matter of months. A person unaware of all the factors that make up oppression might have expected sympathy or even support from the Negro newcomers for the dislodged Japanese, especially in view of the fact that they, the blacks, had themselves undergone concentration camp living for centuries in slavery's plantations and later in sharecroppers' cabins. But the sensations of common relationship were missing. The black newcomer had been recruited on the desiccated farmlands of Georgia and Mississippi by war plant labor scouts. The chance to live in 2- or 3-story apartment buildings, which became instant slums, and to earn 2- and even 3-figured weekly checks was blinding. For the first time, he could think of himself as a boss, a spender. He was able to pay other people to work for him, i.e. the dry cleaners, taxi drivers, waitresses, etc. The shipyards and ammunition plants, brought to booming life by the war, let him know that he was needed and even appreciated, a completely alien yet very pleasant position for him to experience. Who could expect this man to share his new and dizzying importance with concern for a race that he had never known to exist? Another reason for his indifference to the Japanese removal was more subtle, but was more profoundly felt. The Japanese were not white folks. Their eyes, language, and customs belied the white skin and proved to their dark successors that since they didn't have to be feared, neither did they have to be considered. All this was decided unconsciously. No member of my family and none of the family friends ever mentioned the absent Japanese. It was as if they had never owned or lived in the houses we inhabited. On Post Street, where our house was, the hills skidded slowly down to Fillmore, the market heart of our district. In the 2 short blocks before it reached its destination, the street housed 2 day and night restaurants, 2 pool halls, 4 Chinese restaurants, 2 gambling houses, plus diners, shoeshine shops, beauty salons, barber shops, and at least 4 churches. To fully grasp the never-ending activity in San Francisco's Negro neighborhood during the war, one need only know that the 2 blocks described were side streets that were duplicated many times over in the 8 to 10 square block area. The air of collective displacement, the impermanence of life in wartime, and the gauche personalities of the more recent arrivals tended to dissipate my own sense of not belonging. In San Francisco, for the first time, I perceived myself as part of something. Not that I identified with the newcomers, nor with the rare black descendants of native San Franciscans, nor with the whites or even the Asians, but rather with the times and the city. I understood The arrogance of the young sailors who marched the streets in marauding gangs, approaching every girl as if she were at best a prostitute and at worst an Axis agent bent on making the USA lose the war. The undertone of fear that San Francisco would be bombed, which was abetted by weekly air raid warnings and civil defense drills in school, heightened my sense of belonging. Hadn't I always, but ever and ever, thought that life was just one great risk for the living? Then the city acted in wartime like an intelligent woman under siege. She gave what she couldn't with safety withhold and secured those things which lay in her reach. The city became for me the ideal of what I wanted to be as a grown up. Friendly, but never gushing. Cool, but not frigid or distant. Distinguished, without the awful stiffness. To San Franciscans, the city that knows how was the Bay, the fog, Sir Francis Drake Hotel, top of the mark, Chinatown, the Sunset District, and so on and so forth, and so white. To me, a 13-year-old black girl stalled by the South and Southern black lifestyle, the city was a state of beauty and a state of freedom. The fog wasn't simply the steamy vapors off the bay caught and penned in by hills, but a soft breath of anonymity that shrouded and cushioned the bashful traveler. I became dauntless and free of fears, intoxicated by the physical fact of San Francisco. Safe in my protecting arrogance, I was certain that no one loved her as impartially as I. I walked around the Mark Hopkins and gazed at the top of the Mark, but maybe Sour Grapes was more impressed by the view of Oakland from the hill than by the tiered building of its fur-draped visitors. For weeks after the city and I came to terms about my belongings, I haunted the points of interest and found them empty and un-San Francisco. The naval officers with their well-dressed wives and clean white babies inhabited another time-space dimension than I. The well-kept old women in chauffeured cars and blonde girls in buckskin shoes and cashmere sweaters might have been San Franciscans, but they were at most gilt on the frame of my portrait of the city. Pride and Prejudice stalked in tandem the beautiful hills. Native San Franciscans possessive of the city had to cope with an influx not of awed, respectful tourists, but of raucous, unsophisticated provincials. They were also forced to live with skin-deep guilt brought on by the treatment of their former nicey schoolmates. Southern white illiterates brought their biases intact to the west from the hills of Arkansas and the swamps of Georgia. The black ex-farmers had not left their distrust and fear of whites, which history had taught them in distressful lessons. These two groups were obliged to work side by side in the war plants, and their animosities festered and opened like boils on the face of the city. San Franciscans would have sworn on the Golden Gate Bridge that racism was missing from the heart of their air-conditioned city, but they would have been sadly mistaken. A story went the rounds about a San Franciscan white matron who refused to sit beside a Negro civilian on the streetcar, even after he made room for her on the seat. Her explanation was that she would not sit beside a draft dodger who was a Negro as well. She added that the least he could do was fight for his country the way her son was fighting on Iwo Jima. The story said that the man pulled his body away from the window to show an armless sleeve. He said quietly and with great dignity, "Then ask your son to look around for my arm, which I left over there."